Self-driving cars, delivery drones, and fleets of automated mining machines have moved from headlines to habits, but they can only travel as fast as the tech underneath it. On Interconnected, a new show by Equinix that explores the hidden infrastructure behind our connected future, they shed light on the challenges of scaling safety, where computation happens, and a future where cities are built with autonomy in mind. MIT research scientist Brian Reimer and emerging technology leader Patrina Steele explain how the way we move is changing and where the future will take us. Listen on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We're coming to you live from our massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. It's your host, Aaron, and we have a great returning guest and topic this week. We're honored to have James Higginbotham return this week for an update on the world of APIs. A quick programming note for the interview. We both swear James was on the show multiple times, but Google really failed us. At some point, we're going to need to train an LLM about the Cloudcast or something, but we've since found the show in question. And so this is James's third appearance on this show. The first time was 11 years ago, and then 5 years ago. So it's time to talk to James about enterprise APIs and the state of APIs in 2025. And all of that is coming up right after this quick break.
Today's show is brought to you by TestCube. Testing applications in Kubernetes doesn't have to be complicated. TestCube is your go-to platform for cloud-native continuous testing. With TestCube, you can orchestrate, scale, and automate tests effortlessly right within Kubernetes, catching issues early and deploying with confidence. Try it out today and see why engineering teams trust TestCube to keep their testing simple and scalable. Your test, your tools, your infrastructure, finally together. Check it out at testcube.io/cloudcast.
And we're back. And for this week's show, we have a returning guest, but we're going to be talking all about APIs and kind of updates to APIs and digging into all kinds of different topics today. But before we hit record, our guest, we were kind of reminiscing because it has been a while. It has been, I cannot believe this, 11 years since we first spoke on the show. So we have James Higginbotham, API strategist at LaunchAny. So first of all, James, welcome back.
Thank you.
And give everyone a quick introduction, please.
Yeah. So, my background is in software development, software architecture, but the last 12 plus years, I've been focused on web APIs. So just helping organizations with their API program, helping them think about them as more than just a technical detail and treat them as products, as a platform, and really get governance and thoughtfulness behind all of that. So that strategist title is really just kind of a fancy way of saying that I go in and coach organizations on how to think about APIs beyond just a technical asset or a technical task on their to-do list.
Fantastic. And by the way, too, for the listeners out there that have been listening for a long time, both James and I swear there's been more than one appearance on, but as we've approached, 900 and some shows, sometimes Google is tending to fail me these days. So I'll kind of put a bounty out there for the audience. If anybody finds the other show besides 153, email us, show@thecloudcast.net or aaron@thecloudcast.net, because I would love to figure this out. We need to get an LLM going, James.
Yeah, definitely.
So I'm going to dive right in, but let's kind of set the table here first. Like, to say we've come a long way with APIs, as an industry is an understatement from when we spoke many years ago. So let's kind of start there. Like, in your interactions with enterprise customers, what trends and standards are currently top of mind that you end up speaking about and consulting about the most?
Yeah, when we last talked, I was still doing a lot of training about what is an API. I mean, that's kind of where we were at. Some people knew about them, some people didn't. Now what I'm seeing is the discussions are shifting a lot, and the organizations that I work with will typically say, we see APIs as our digital front door. We see them as highly valuable. They're a digital asset we want to invest in. So they go beyond just how does HTTP work? Do we do REST? We have a lot of discussions about REST, GraphQL, gRPC, all the usual suspects, and those are great conversations to have. But really, the organizations are seeing it as, I want to see my API program as more than just a task in a Jira ticket or, on my backlog or as a user story. I want to think about these things as ways that are going to improve the conversations we have with our customers, with our partners. They're table stakes now for a lot of organizations, but beyond that, there's a lot more to it. So the conversations we're having are a lot deeper. How do I manage my portfolio? What do I do when I start getting a lot of APIs and now I feel like I don't have control or can't get everybody on board, or they're just everywhere now. And so, they're kind of the way of doing business today. We assume that APIs are being built out. Some organizations see it strategically, like I talked about, and some don't. And so it's those kinds of conversations. How do I either get there, or once I'm there, how do I really improve and mature my efforts?
Yeah, that's perfect. And while we're kind of talking about that, because I really like that topic of API sprawl, because I was really digging into APIs. Gosh, it'd be about a year and a half ago now, and I was doing a bunch of research on it, and it was super interesting to me. Like, one of the biggest things I kept finding, like, there's all these stats and all these numbers of how much of the traffic is on the just internet globally is APIs, and then now it's like how much of that is AI APIs, which I'm sure we'll talk about at some point as well. Mm-hmm. But this whole idea of, like, there's a lot of organizations out there. Yeah, they've gone from, hey, what is an API, to what kind of API do I develop, to I have so many APIs, I don't even know where they all are.
Right. Yeah,
anymore.
There's a lot.
And so let's kind of talk about that real quick. This, API sprawl, like, how do you advise folks to kind of wrap their head around it, to get hold of it, wrangle it to the ground, and then ultimately get it all organized and controlled? Let's talk about that first of all.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot to that. And a lot of the discussions I have will be around, do I get a lot more strict with my governance policies? How do I manage when APIs go out the door? What I like to do is to really get them to shift their mindset to, is the API the API portfolio as a whole, everything that you have, the things that you have and the things you don't know you have, because they've just kind of emerged over time. What kind of APIs are you producing? Are you producing APIs that I would classify as like a platform API or a digital capability? It's something that represents how you do business. It lines up with your business capabilities, your business architecture. So in the insurance space, it's underwriting and claims and tracking those details, and then supporting brokers and carriers. In the banking industry, it would be your accounts and the profiles that you have and the customers that you have and so on, and maybe loans that you're providing, or the revolving credit lines and so on and so forth. Are they those platform APIs, which we really should be thoughtful about, or are they the APIs that are kind of more supporting? They're those back-end services. They're bridging systems. They're moving data around. And they're supporting front ends, our React, our Angular, all of our different front end applications that we have. And so we want to look at it from that perspective and say, what kind of strictness and compliance do we want? How do we catalog these things? How do we secure them? And to what level of rigor do we have? And that might vary based on that. But having those kinds of paths in the platform engineering space, we talk about the golden path for developers. How do I get applications out the door in my infrastructure so they're observable and secured and cataloged and known and managed properly? We want to do the same thing with APIs. So we start having conversations about that. Where are your APIs coming from? Where and how are developers building those APIs out, and what are their purposes? And then we kind of go from there.
I love that. And I love the fact that you brought up the golden paths, because, as we've done platform engineering podcasts in the past, that golden paths analogy, I think, really cements an idea very quickly. So let me ask you this twofold question. Okay. As you're talking to enterprise customers, what are those typical golden paths and use cases you end up talking to customers about? And then part of that as well, I'm kind of bringing the platform engineering mindsets from a little while ago back into this. Is API something that like needs a product manager? Like I've heard mixed things at times. If it's like, oh, if it's external, it's a product manager because then it's typically a product, or like if it's internal, like tell me a little bit about where your head is at of like this integration and these golden paths and how you kind of staff the organization in the
so I think from a golden path perspective, we want to see all of our APIs, observable and protected in some way. Some organizations just simply use an API gateway, and I say simply not to. There's a lot of complexity in that, and oftentimes they have multiple instances, particularly those that are under heavy regulatory requirements. They might have separate APIs deployed behind separate API gateways, so that their auditing that they're going to have to go through for the regulatory requirements, particularly say in banking, when they go through auditing, it's much easier to audit the use of those APIs than it is to try to dig those out of one big API gateway where everything is at. So they'll have a fabric or a series of API gateways that are out there that address different needs, different purposes. Those that support the web and mobile apps, those that support internal use cases. Sometimes we'll see service meshes come into play. Those are still a thing in the enterprise. And as we have a lot of service-to-service communication. So what we want to do is we want to look at that and say, okay, how do we have a golden path that ensures that developers don't have to understand the details of Kubernetes, don't have to understand the details of the API gateway. They can specify where their API fits within the portfolio, what URL path it kind of belongs to in their overall portfolio of APIs. And to go to that point then goes into your second question, which is, how do I manage these things? And oftentimes what I see in enterprise is a small group. They'll be called the Center of Excellence, Center for Enablement, so an API COE, C4E. Sometimes it's your platform engineering teams that are doing that. Sometimes it's a dedicated team. Oftentimes it's somewhere between 1 and 5 people. And I do have a client that has 15,000 developers, about 2,500 agile teams. And you can't take 5 people and have them manage that number of APIs that are produced by those developers. So we oftentimes then have to look at, let's have a centralized team. They're bringing in that product mindset. They usually have more of a product background, but they also understand APIs and understand the nuances of HTTP and REST versus GraphQL and all those different types of discussions that need to be had with development teams. But they also bring in that product mindset and say, where does this fit? That team then will oftentimes build up a federated coaching program so that people are trained and become representatives of that COE, so that 1 to 5 person team across the different domains, across the different lines of business. And they bring that product mentality and that portfolio management down to the domain area. So they're taking that domain expertise they have and they're combining that with their passion for APIs to support teams right there. So when you have multiple offices, a lot of times we'll have one office is focused more on, let's say, in the banking industry, and one office is more on the auto loans, and another one's for credit cards, and another one's for so on. So you have all these different really deeply involved teams that understand the domain well. We can get those coaches there so that we don't have these ivory tower 5 people that are keeping people from getting things done and not understanding what you're doing day to day, what that domain needs require in their APIs. So there's a lot of blend, but bringing in a product management or a product mindset from a platform engineering team, depending on how the organization is structured, is absolutely critical. There's definitely a cultural aspect to that some organizations miss.
No, I love that. Thank you. And James, let me ask you this then too, because I think probably one of the other big things here is there's SaaS providers out there. There's, just third-party services, take authentication or payments or some of these other, API interfaces that could be brought in versus, it's the classic build versus buy, right? And what are you seeing is that delineation of build versus buy? When do you build? When do you buy? And also, too, are we at a point where the API industry is mature enough that it is something as simple as like, hey, get some API gateways. Here's your authentication service. Here's your payment service. Here's these other things. You kind of integrate it all together, and then you're down to just writing APIs for the only true core differentiation for your business. Or are we still not quite that mature yet. Where do you think we are
I
in
see
that?
a mixture of that. I'm definitely seeing people, let's say the marketing side is fully embraced APIs and said, we don't want to manage emails and compliance and everything else. Let's offload that. And they'll oftentimes what they'll do is they'll for the large organizations, they'll have their procurement teams work out, negotiate a deal for the scale of the entire enterprise. And then they'll put that API behind their own internal API gateway so that when a developer needs to send an email, they're not having to go connect up and learn about the third-party API necessarily. They'll bring that in-house, manage it, assign tokens internally for access to it, allowing procurement to get a deal at scale and not every team having to pick their own email provider or their own campaign management and CRM solutions and things. They'll bring those things external in-house. You'll use those APIs and you'll manage them with your own internal gateway so that you're not having to go to that third party to provision tokens. You have your own enterprise set of tokens that are then kind of redistributed internally to your developers with your own internal gateway and your own internal API tokens. So we're seeing things like that. We see a lot of organizations working with standards and practice. We have a lot of standards that are out now in different industries, and they're needing to comply with those standards, but those never satisfy what they need. So sometimes off-the-shelf solutions will support those standards, but may not support how you do your business internally. And so it might be those differentiators that we build internally, or it might be just leveraging those systems as kind of a closed-off system that we use to manage the workflows, to manage the compliance, to manage the standards interoperability, while still doing a lot of work internally. So I'm not really seeing a lot of organizations that are just kind of purely taking commercial off-the-shelf APIs and building solutions with them. I still don't think we're there yet, because I think the differentiators are what's key. And both the standards and the off-the-shelf solutions that we see out there just don't really satisfy what the organizations want to do, how they want to work, how they want to differentiate themselves, and how they interface with their customers and their partners. So we definitely see it's a combination of things. So you're building a lot of internal bespoke APIs, as well as bringing in those external ones and managing those. And so it becomes this ecosystem of a combination of those things.
No, that's great. And let me ask you this, though, because we did talk about standards, and you and I, before we hit record, we were talking about some other things as well related to standards and kind of your work with that. So tell me a little bit about, like, what is the current standard? What is the current things that matter, the current trends when it comes to, like, okay, if you're building something today, you're typically thinking about this kind of standard or this kind of documentation tool, or like, what is the, for lack of a better term, the stack look like right now? Like, what's the state of APIs in 2025?
Yeah, there's, I'm going to say there's some good things and there's some really frustrating things. I think with all things, it's like that. But in the API space in 2020, we would think that we'd have a lot more tools out there that were kind of standardized. We have things like the Open API specification. That's still a big thing. It was formerly called Swagger. So those of you that maybe refer to it as Swagger because of using it in the early days when that was how it was branded, but the Open API spec underneath the Linux Foundation, the async API spec, which is a complementary that allows us to capture and catalog our events and our streams and any kind of webhooks and WebSockets and all of those other things that may be more asynchronous in nature, not just request responsive HTTP. We see a lot of that. And then, of course, on the GraphQL side, we see, the SDL, the schema definition language. On gRPC, we have the IDL, the interface definition language. We have all of those things that it can describe what an API does. And out of that comes documentation. Out of that can come code generation. Out of that can become a bit more tooling support. But we've seen, and you may have discussed in one of your earlier podcasts, I'm sure, about Backstage and the growth of that open source ecosystem as a catalog. So we see that for cataloging APIs sometimes. But there's still a lot of work to be done. So we use those standards to describe what our API does, but it becomes still difficult to figure out what that stack of tools are. It's kind of, every organization has selected their own tools, and a lot of them center around those standards that I mentioned for describing APIs. There's a lot of vendors that are out there now emerging that are helping with the documentation effort. Documentation's hard. I spent a lot of time with a with a worldwide hotel chain to try to help them make sense of how do I build documentation for my internal development teams while still being able to build documentation for my partners. And those partners might be OTAs, the Expedias and the other channels that they advertise their availability through. So how do I open up certain APIs and give them documentation without making them think that they can participate in our entire e-commerce ecosystem and supply chain? How do I open these things up for third-party developers and so on? So there's a lot of those challenges. And now we're seeing vendors stepping up. There's a lot of really great companies out there that are stepping up and saying, we get that now. And so we can help you produce documentation portals that are tailored to those particular different needs and use cases. And so we're starting to see maturity there. We're starting to see some maturity in some areas as far as code generation or code frameworks that take your APIs a bit further, that do a lot of the heavy lifting for you, that help you get some of those things done quickly. But there's still a lot of work to be done. There's some vendors now emerging that are helping to manage the lifecycle in the enterprise. That's really the hardest and the newest area that I'm seeing in the tool space is tools that help you to not only design your APIs thoughtfully, but collaboratively design them to apply your compliance and regulatory requirements on top of them. There's a lot to it now that are starting to come up so that we don't accidentally leak data that we shouldn't, that cybersecurity teams can go take a look at what we're building and say, that looks good, don't release that, separate this off to a separate API operation, or let's lock this down in a different way with the API gateway. Lots of things to consider in that space. So there's a lot of things out there. But fundamentally, they still center on things like Open API and other standards that have been out there for a while, which is great.
And James, let me ask you this then too, because while we were talking about all the standards, it kind of made me think about like, okay, a lot of areas we talk about have pretty diverse ecosystems, and like you mentioned Backstage, and you mentioned Open API standards, but here's the thing, I feel like APIs as a product is an area where certain areas have been monetized, certain areas haven't been, right? Like you've got Kong out there, for instance, or, back for a little while there, for a hot minute, there was the API security companies like No Name Security and some of those others, right? And so like there was this probably a couple years ago now, this trend of like, okay, APIs were the hot thing. And they were getting, startup funding. I don't see that as much. I mean, I don't know if that's just because it's getting drowned out by AI. And then maybe that's where we kind of shift to next from a discussion standpoint is like, has AI really taken over this API segment? What's been the impact of AI on APIs?
Yeah,
I have some follow-up questions, but let's start there.
No, yeah. The AI has definitely had a huge impact on APIs, and you're right. What you're seeing, your observations are correct, which is we're seeing a lot less focus in funding startups that are AI or API specific, and everybody's going toward AI. So in some cases, a lot of these API tool vendors are really being tested. Their metals being tested of, are we really delivering the value that we say we are? And I think some of them are proving they are, and some are proving that, well, maybe there was an opportunity there for funding. Maybe there's an opportunity to just see what the market would respond to. But in the end, people are maybe not as amenable to that, or maybe not willing to put their money there as heavily as they used to. So we're still seeing enterprises are still having a licensed gateway, still having a licensed catalog, API cataloging tools and other solutions, testing frameworks, testing tools, and so on. That's still happening. It's just not front of mind in the discussions in the circles. Everything's shifted kind of to AI, which has been a fascinating thing. But all of that still, every organization still really needs that API discipline. And so what I found is there's organizations that they either understand the value of APIs and they're really investing in those tools and getting those disciplines in-house. They're establishing pillars and processes and policies. They're looking at how their APIs reflect how they do business and blending that business architecture with their API surface area that they're providing to their customers, to their partners. Or they're just seeing it as a development task They minimally support that API, those API tools. They probably don't have all the right infrastructure in place to do that. And so they're still kind of struggling. The developers are kind of struggling to get things out the door as they start shifting this mindset toward an AI perspective. So it's becoming really a differentiator. Either they've determined that they are seeing APIs in an API first culture as important and they're getting there, and then that's powering their AI efforts, or they're not, and they're now having to play catch up even more so than they were over the last decade as APIs started to be discussed more and more, and revenue opportunities, or at least table stakes of making sure that you're going to close those deals because you have an API to allow for automation and integration. Is either there or not there, and they're feeling that pain, and AI is just kind of amplifying that now as a result.
Sure. And I feel like I've been, this has been I feel like I'll end of a lot of podcasts lately with like, okay, what's the trends of AI? And we talk about that. And then we talk about what's the trends of AI and security. And then we talk about that. And so we're going to talk about that.
Okay.
So here's where I'm going with this is, especially as we move into agentic AI, I see, okay, there's a lot of like API traffic on the internet that is absolutely like us talking to systems and interacting with systems. But now there's a certain amount of AI and agentic AI going and doing things through API calls, right? And so where and how do you think about this intersection of security and AIs and APIs all in one? Because I can see this being very perilous.
Yeah, definitely.
At times.
So let me back up a little bit before we get into security, and then you can ask that question to me again if I don't get to it. But let me share a little bit about. So what I'm seeing now is there's this fascinating trend where AI, people were playing around with the chat interfaces for a couple of years, trying to see what it could do. Then they started figuring out that it could write some code, and now everybody's chasing code generation. And so that's kind of where I'm seeing a lot of it. So if you watch X, and then as the joke goes, next week you watch LinkedIn for the same thing, you start seeing the conversations around a lot of this. What code can I build? Can I one-shot things? What can I do with AI to build code? Is SaaS as a business strategy going to die because I can start building my own solutions with AI? And everybody thinks about generating code. I think what I like to do, that the enterprise is they're doing two things. One, they're trying to chase that path, trying to figure out, can we write code faster? But there's an opportunity that I think that they're starting to explore, but it's still early days, which is we've had these business analyst, business developer roles for a long time in the enterprise. They're the people that sit in spreadsheets and they write macros and they automate their world as best they can. And then they started using things like Zapier and other solutions to sort of optimize and automate their day-to-day. Those class of people inside the enterprise are currently unserved with AI and could be in a dramatic way. AI with its pattern matching and the capabilities, the tools that it brings to bear, with the LLM strategies that we have today and the machine learning strategies we had prior that was powering data science, all of these different things that we've had evolve, there is this opportunity to broaden our perspective of AI beyond code generation. But everybody's just trying to figure out how to write code. And so what I'm encouraging enterprises to do is to step back and evaluate what they do day to day, their operational model, their business architecture, how do they organize themselves, how do they execute day to day. So there's a lot of need for that. And that's where I spend a lot of my time is how do we break down an existing process, then figure out where do APIs fit in and how do those needs come into play? What APIs do we have? What gaps exist to support those processes? And then how do we empower those people that would traditionally been writing VBA scripts and macros and things like that to get things done? Because those folks are the ones that are technically deep enough to be able to take advantage of what we're building beyond just writing a bunch of code. So we have to ask ourselves, are we just writing more code faster? and we're not getting to the destination we want to be? Or do we have a vision of where we need to be? And then we're empowering people with APIs and AI. And then that opens up kind of the security discussion as well. But that's kind of where I'm seeing things. There's a huge opportunity. I teach people how to design APIs. I have this methodology that I've written about in my book, Principles of Web API Design, called ADDR: Align, Define, Design, Refine. It's basically 4 phases of how do you go from requirements to an API design that reflects how you do business. If we have those things in place, then we can actually design APIs that represent how we do business, which now makes it a lot easier to take a business user's vocabulary. If they were to write a prompt engineer something, their vocabulary is going to be different than a developer's vocabulary. So if you're writing APIs and composing APIs that just expose systems and data, and you're moving JSON across the wire, and that's all you're concerned about, then the business users have to speak developer. But if the developers are willing to come meet those business users and speak that business language, then the prompts become very powerful, because now what we can do is we have APIs that speak that language, and we have an AI that can orchestrate those connections together. And so now we have this unification of different worlds that I think we wanted in the digital transformation decade that we went through, but what we ended up doing is just modernizing our systems. So if we really start thinking about how do we digitize our business processes, then our LLMs can do a lot more. Now, we can leverage those LLMs to code generate and do other things behind the scenes. That's great. Spec-driven design and development is kind of an interesting way of looking at that, taking the big picture, breaking it down into units, and handing those units off to our LLMs to build things smaller, which means we need people that can decompose solutions and think about that. So now what we're doing is we're shifting our skill set. And so our APIs become absolutely critical. They need to speak the language of the business, not the language of our systems. And then once we do that, we can start exposing those things to our business users. So that starts to open up now that security opportunity and challenges, which is now we're going to have LLMs acting on our behalf to non-deterministically call APIs in different ways. And I need to make sure that my credentials are passed all the way down. And there's been some discussion about that. MCP, the Model Context Protocol, is that glue that helps us get our APIs into our LLMs. And they've been really, spending a lot of time thinking about how do we firm up our security? How do we bring the API tokens and the API, the authentication and authorization aspects of APIs into our LLMs? We're now going to have agents running on our behalf. They have to represent us. So they're kind of a digital echo of us. And we need to have that security now placed there. So it's not happening inside of a user interface where I'm directly interacting with it. It's happening in the background. So there's a lot more of the things we had to do in the enterprise to secure APIs, authorization tokens and refresh tokens and mutual TLS and to secure point-to-point connections and have all these kind of cascading credentials, and all that becomes even more important. So that's where I go back to saying, if enterprises have been developing their API disciplines and their practices, including their security practices, over the last decade, then they're positioned really well to take advantage of this new opportunity. And APIs can play with LLMs and can generate code and can interface with our business users. If they haven't been, now they're really going to have to scramble to get things done, because you have to have everything we've been doing in the last decade to really play in this now AI space. So APIs are still critical, although the funding and the conversations in the marketplace aren't as prevalent. It's still there. And if you don't have all those pieces, then the AI pieces become harder and harder to take advantage of. So there's a lot going on right now, and people are kind of scrambling to figure out what this looks like.
Sure. That's amazing. And yeah, to be clear though, and link in the show notes, there is full plug. There is an upcoming report on AI assisted API design also that I wanted to just kind of bring everyone's attention to. There's lots of links in the show notes there. But I think that's actually a great place to kind of close us out there. James, if anyone out there is interested, what's the best way they could get started? There's of course some links in the show notes. Is there, how can they reach out to you or just, have a chat if they want to learn more?
Yeah, absolutely. They can reach out to me via my primary website or via LinkedIn. They can find me on there. Launchany.com, UNCHANY.com. I believe that's going to be in the show notes as well. So you can contact me that way. The other thing you can do is I run a site called APIcoach.io. APIcoach.io is my training that I've been doing, enterprise training, available to individuals. So that's available as well. So if you want to just kind of dive in and start understanding, get started, that's the way to do it. Or just reach out to me, LinkedIn or an X. I'm pretty busy on both of those, chatting with people. So just drop me a message, and I'd love to chat with you further about, maybe some questions that came up from our chat today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, James. Everyone out there, thank you very much for listening this week. On behalf of Brian, who wasn't able to make it this week, and myself, thank you everyone for listening, and we certainly appreciate your time. And if you enjoy the show, please leave us a review. If you can leave a review wherever you get your podcasts, we would certainly love that. And also tell a friend or send us feedback at any time. Feedback is in the show notes as well, all the different channels and how to reach us. On behalf of Brian and myself, thank you everyone for listening, and we will talk to everyone next week.
Thank you for listening to the Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.